The story begins with water moving like a deliberate civil power through a city. An ordered, metallic river carried across arches and tunnels, poured into public basins and private cisterns, and offered to the thirsty and the weary without question. Picture at dawn, the stone ribs of an aqueduct catching pale light. Imagine steam rising off a crowded bathhouse where steam and conversation mingle, and where the city's pulse is measured in the steady hiss of water. For the people who lived beneath those arches, the city's cleanliness was not merely a matter of vanity or ritual. It was an achievement of craft and authority. Channels cut by engineers, codes kept by magistrates, and a daily choreography of servants, slaves, and artisans who tended pipes, cleared drains, and swept courtyards. In Rome and in other great cities of antiquity, the ambitions of civic life were written in stone and water. Long before the idea of public health had a name, municipal infrastructure performed some of its tasks. The great sewers and conduits, the buried arteries of antiquity, carried away storm water and the effluvia of public baths and latrines. Fountains and aqueducts brought fresh water in from distant springs. Public latrines and baths created places for the many to share the supplies of a civilized city. These were not merely conveniences. Where they functioned, they shaped daily habits, markets, and even the location of craft workshops. Archaeology and the careful study of ruins have made plain that the presence of such systems in one era affects how cities survive and how their remains appear to later eyes. Yet the sight that so often opens a modern viewer's imagination, marble aqueducts and marble baths, tells only part of the story. The Cloaca Maxima, the great drain of Rome, was at once engineering triumph and a social mirror. It channeled water and refuse alike, and its success depended on enormous human labor and a social order that would not allow its arteries to be clogged. Even in Roman times, the relationship between plumbing and health was imperfect. Pipes served many ends, and populations were unequal in their access to services. The ideal of continuous flow and public amenity often masked the harsher realities of density, smell, and social division. Yet for centuries, the presence of that continuous flow made a difference that would not be quick to be forgotten. When a mighty polity weakens, its machines of maintenance are among the first things to falter. The fall of imperial authority in Western lands dispersed resources, broke the bureaucratic chains that had paid laborers and kept drains clear, and altered the economics of urban upkeep. Arches that had carried water into a city were left to be scavenged for stone. Workers who had cleaned drains found other employments or were scattered by war and migration. Over the course of generations, the visible architecture could remain while the invisible work of running and repairing infrastructure diminished. A network is only as durable as the institutions that tend it. Archaeologists and historians who trace the transition from late antiquity into what we call the medieval world emphasize that the disappearance of regular maintenance changed what cities smelled like, how rainwater moved through streets, and whether a household's waste remained close at hand or was carried outward. So the narrative turns, a memory of aqueducts and baths, followed by a slow ebb in bureaucratic capacity and urban hygiene. Yet it would be wrong to imagine a single, uniform collapse in which everything ancient was instantly lost. Across the long sweep of centuries, there were places where older practices lingered, where local elites preserved pipes and cisterns, and where towns adapted surviving fragments into new uses. At the same time, new patterns of settlement and commerce changed how people related to water and waste. Markets multiplied within narrow alleys, houses crowded together around wells and public fountains. Fecal waste, household refuse, tannery effluent, and slaughterhouse offal all shared the same urban space in ways that a city's plumbing had once pulled apart. The result was never a pure regression, but rather a recalibration of urban life under new economic and social constraints. Walk with me through a late morning market in a medieval town. The stone flagstones are slick where animals have passed. A woman hauls a clay jar of spring water up to a stall. Children dart between legs. A pailful of offal is thrown unceremoniously into a gutter. The street echoes with the cawing of birds and the shouted prices of vegetables. The sensory world here is immediate and uncompromising. The engineer's slow hand is absent. Maintenance, where it exists, is local and often improvised. Where municipal power is present, it often legislates small, precise remedies. Move the latrine a measure away from the well, line the cesspit with stone, pay a commoner to clear the street once a week. These ordinances and local statutes appear across medieval legal records, signs that urban communities did not simply surrender to filth, but attempted to govern it through rules that mixed public interest with private obligation. Here we encounter two truths that must be held together. First, in many towns there existed a surprising range of municipal rules, inspectors, and seasonal labor that addressed human waste. Enforcement could be strict when civic pride or commerce demanded it. Second, scientific understanding of disease was not yet what we would recognize. People explained pestilence and putrid smells through frameworks that blended observation, religious meaning, and the doctrine of polluted air. The observation that filth often preceded sickness led to practical measures, but the underlying causal model, the reasons why cleaning might prevent harm, was encoded in language of scent, corruption, and moral disorder rather than in the language of invisible microbes. This mixture of observation and theory would shape policies for centuries. Cities cleaned what they could, even when the logic for cleaning remained unsettled. Personal stories illuminate these broad currents. Consider the washerwoman who comes down each dawn to a public stream. She scrubs linen against the stone and hears her neighbors talk of a fever that has taken 2 houses down the lane. She has no microscope, no map that plots the ghostly path of a pathogen, but she knows the linking fact that the well nearest her has recently been surrounded by new latrines. Or consider the magistrate who signs an ordinance ordering cesspits to be moved further from the communal fountain because merchants complain that customers avoid their stalls whenever the wind blows from a particular alley. That magistrate knows that trade is threatened. He understands the civic economy, even if the deeper biology remains beyond reach. These human moments show the reasoning of daily life, prudence. Reputation and commerce pushed municipal leaders to adopt regulations that, in practice, sometimes accomplished what modern sanitation would do later. There are also quieter, less triumphalist scenes worth holding in the mind. In towns that grew without planned drainage, rain could become a slow, grinding adversary. When heavy skis massed over a city, streets that had functioned all summer as dry conduits suddenly turned to channels that carried refuse into wells and cellars. Households on the lower slopes of a town might find their floors damp with the runoff from wealthier streets above. In places where a centuries-old cistern was filled with silt and abandoned, people would break the lime-lined vaults for building stone rather than restore them. Such pragmatic choices reshaped the urban fabric in ways that were practical but fragile. When disaster struck, the lack of a systemized response produced a cascade of local emergencies. The archaeology of medieval towns, when read closely, reveals these material decisions, an architecture of compromise. And yet the medieval world was not a single story of neglect. Across the map of Europe and beyond, there were experiments in regulated waste removal, paid night collectors, and ordinances prescribing how privies should be constructed and emptied. Some cities required that cesspits be lined with stone and located a measured distance from wells. Others set fines for those who cast refuse into the river or who ran slaughterhouse blood into the public way. These rules were at once aesthetic, economic, and sanitary. They aimed to preserve commerce, to limit foul airs, and to prevent the kind of public embarrassment that drove customers away. The existence of these regulations complicates the common image of a medieval populace indifferent to filth. People then felt their environment keenly and acted upon it within the knowledge and means available to them. If this first movement of our story has a moral, it is one of continuity and adaptation rather than of simple loss. The blueprint of ancient sanitation left its marks, even as political collapse and shifting economies altered their function. Municipal actors in the medieval world, whether magistrates, guilds, or informal neighborhood associations, developed a repertoire of responses to refuse and water that mixed engineering fragments with local custom and legal imagination. The city that arises from these practices is not the engineered metropolis of an earlier millennium, nor yet the modern, scientifically governed city that will emerge later. It is something between, a set of lived arrangements that will both constrain and make possible future reforms. Before the next crisis asks sharper questions about water and disease, let us pause on one image that holds across centuries. The water jar held to lips that have no certainty, the public fountain that gathers gossip, the magistrate who pens an ordinance and hopes it will bind behavior. These are human acts of management and imagination. They keep a city running or let it falter, and they prefigure a tension that will come to define the modern sweep of public health. Who pays to clean the city? Who decides what counts as filth? And what happens when the supposed source of life, water itself, turns into a carrier of death? Such a question is not hypothetical. It will arrive in a form more terrible and more clarifying than any municipal ordinance. An epidemic that moves through the veins of a city and forces people to ask whether their daily patterns of living, trading, and drawing water are the causes of their misfortune. That arrival will test the uneasy accommodations of a post-imperial urban world and will compel new answers, both scientific and political, to the age-old puzzle of how a city keeps itself clean. As the world's communities shifted from scattered clusters of houses and fields into ordered places of commerce and congregation, something remarkable and unsettling took shape. People began to leave behind the rhythms of rural life, where the concerns of every household were bounded by its own fence and fields, and walked with purpose into the crowded knots of streets and market squares that were the early modern city. The very word urban began to conjure images not just of opportunity and trade, but of dense human masses casting their shadows over narrow thoroughfares. This burgeoning of urban life, from the Atlantic ports of Western Europe to trading hubs along the Danube, was not merely demographic. It was cultural, economic, and ecological. In the span of what we now call the early modern period, cities became engines of change and at the same time crucibles of public health challenge. The rhythm of daily life in these rising cities bore both the promise and the peril of proximity. A merchant unloading bales of cloth at the quay shared space with laborers carting barrels of grain. Children played around public fountains while dogs and livestock weaved between their legs. Wherever humanity gathered closely together without the deliberate systems to manage its waste, filth accumulated. Street gutters, once channels for occasional rainwater, soon bore the weight of chamber pot contents, animal offal, and the refuse of everyday life. By the 16th century, many burgeoning towns had introduced cesspits, rudimentary repositories for human waste, beneath or beside buildings whose ground floors conveyed the bustle of trade and living. These pits, necessary in the absence of integrated drainage, could not contend with the volumes produced by growing populations, and often spilled into streets, courtyards, and eventually, the very water sources on which residents relied. In many accounts, the idea of filth in these cities is synonymous with a persistent odor that hung in the air like a mute indictment of urban life. Yet historians caution against seeing this merely as sensory dismay. What seemed at first a nuisance was in fact an early indicator of ecological stress, an imbalance between human density and environmental capacity. Because most cities lacked planned sewage systems, inhabitants emptied their waste into streets or nearby rivers. These rivers, in turn, were often the same channels from which water was drawn for drinking, cooking, and washing. In doing so, the urban environment became a feedback loop of contamination. Nature, once an implicit partner in the flushing of refuse through land and water, was being overwhelmed by the scale of human settlement. Across Europe and beyond, This pattern repeated itself with local variations. Northern Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, among the more densely populated urban regions in the late 15th century, labored with water management that balanced canals, limited drainage, and the demands of commerce. Meanwhile, in the Low Countries, where towns like Bruges and Ghent hugged canals and trading canals, the movement of water became both asset and liability. These very waterways, lifelines for merchandise and trade, often carried the accumulated waste from houses and tanneries outward, and then back inward when tides shifted. The physical geography of these cities transformed living conditions in ways that had both immediate and insidious consequences for health and daily life. There were practical attempts to manage these problems, and not only in whispered lamentations about foul air or prideful demands for clean streets. Civic authorities in towns issued ordinances about waste disposal, about where slaughterhouses could operate, and about how often gutters must be cleaned. These rules, while unevenly enforced, reveal that urban leaders did not simply accept the filth that accompanied urban growth, they struggled to govern it. For example, entries in city records from Scottish burghs in the late 17th century noted the expense of street cleaning and removal of refuse, justified not only in hygienic terms, but as matters of community pride and trade attractiveness. These records indicate a recognition that the physical environment was connected to well-being. Yet even with such ordinances, the impressions of visitors and residents alike tell a more visceral story. Imagine a growing port town at the height of a busy trading season. Ships from distant harbors crowd the quays, crates of spices, textiles and iron arrive in a jumble, and the cries of sailors echo over the cries of market vendors. Between the quays and the alleys lie overflowing gutters, narrow, deep, and foul, in which the detritus of commerce and community commingles. The sun's heat intensifies the odors and makes the air heavy with particles, some visible, many invisible. People on horseback lift their heads instinctively above the stink. Pedestrians step gingerly around puddles of brackish water. From an elevated perspective, it might seem like life teeming in every direction. From the ground, the sense is of being surrounded by humanity, and yet constantly bumping against the consequences of its bodily functions. This dissonance between bustling prosperity and persistent squalor was the hallmark of early modern urban experience. For ordinary residents, the relationship with these conditions was complex. They could not simply leave the city when rains turned streets to mud and gutters to floating graveyards of refuse, nor could they easily articulate the cause of the wave of fevers and wasting illnesses that periodically swept through dense neighborhoods. The prevailing medical explanations of the time did not yet comprehend germ theory, the idea that invisible organisms might cause disease, but rather invoked miasmas, or corrupted airs arising from putrid matter. Filth was not only an olfactory insult, it was a perceived atmospheric threat. This belief shaped both responses and anxieties. If foul smells were thought to carry sickness, then cleansing the city of odors became a proxy for preserving health. Though scientifically imprecise, this logic nonetheless propelled efforts to pave streets, widen thoroughfares, and clear refuse from public spaces. It laid conceptual groundwork for future sanitary reform movements. As the age of exploration and mercantile capitalism progressed, so too did the scale of urban concentration. Coastal cities such as Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London grew into regional powerhouses by the early 17th century as trade routes linked continents and drew migrants from countryside and hinterland alike. Population figures that had once been measured in mere tens of thousands began, in some of these seaports, to approach the low hundreds of thousands. These numbers were unprecedented, and the existing environmental mechanisms, natural drainage, rivers, and wind, were insufficient to disperse the consequences of such density. Yet technical innovation in sanitation infrastructure had not yet caught up. Human waste and industrial effluent gathered in the same spaces where people worked, lived, and drew water for daily use. The lack of adequate sanitation was not merely an aesthetic disgrace. It had measurable effects on mortality and morbidity. Contemporary records from parish burial registers show that outbreaks of fevers, dysenteries, and unknown wasting illnesses clustered in the most crowded and unclean quarters of towns. These patterns, even if not fully understood in causal terms at the time, reflected a rough correlation between density, filth, and disease. In some places, when epidemics struck, authorities resorted to quarantines or isolated the sick in makeshift infirmaries outside city walls, efforts that were more reactive than preventive, but which at least acknowledged the threat of contagious illness. The inability to anticipate the precise agent of contagion did not stop urban communities from trying to respond to its spread. Rather, it pushed them to seek ways of making the environment less hostile to life. The tension between prosperity and peril posed a profound question for inhabitants and leaders alike. How could cities continue to thrive as centers of trade, culture, and innovation, while also protecting the health of their populations? This question, quietly present in the minds of magistrates and craftsmen, merchants and midwives, hovered over conversations in taverns and council chambers alike. In the alleys and squares of the early modern city, the very ground on which people walked was a lived lesson in the costs and contradictions of urban life, a condition that would soon demand new thinking, new tools, and new collective responses to hygiene and health. This question foreshadows the crises that will erupt in the next phase of our narrative. Crises that will reveal not only the limits of ad hoc responses, but also the possibilities of coordinated action. Where cities once tolerated filth as the price of their own success, they will soon confront diseases whose ferocity cannot be denied or dismissed. Such diseases will drive reformers and populations alike to reconsider the relationship between urban life and sanitation, and to envision systems of waste removal, clean water, and public hygiene that reach beyond fleeting ordinances into the realm of institutional responsibility. In the summer of the year 1854, as the sun climbed high and days stretched long over the labyrinthine streets of London, the city faced a menace that would shake the very foundations of how people understood sickness and cities alike. The relentless growth of urban populations, the crowded tenements and alleys, and the inadequate handling of water and waste had set the stage for a catastrophe whose magnitude few could have imagined. And in the heart of the Soho district, a snug patchwork of narrow thoroughfares, breakneck commerce, and crowded dwellings, the crisis would ignite with astonishing suddenness. It began, by the first days of September, with whispers of a disease that brought relentless vomiting and uncontrollable diarrhea, a malady whose victims seemed to slip from life with terrifying speed. Within weeks, more than 600 souls had perished, and the cluster of deaths pointed to an invisible agent that would come to redefine public health for generations. This was not the first time London had seen cholera. Waves of the disease had surged through the city in earlier decades, as part of the third great pandemic that spread from South Asia across continents. In 1831, the disease first reached British shores, carrying in its wake tens of thousands of deaths, and leaving an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the capital. Yet in successive epidemics, the cause of the illness remained elusive. Some blamed corrupted airs, miasmas, rising from filth in crowded streets. Others invoked divine punishment or humoral imbalance. No theory commanded universal assent, and most public health authorities were as bewildered as those who buried the dead or tended the dying. In that crucible of misunderstanding lived a physician named John Snow. Born in the year 1813 in the northern city of York, Snow had carved out a practice in London and watched with growing concern the recurrent crises of cholera that seemed to stalk the city's poorest districts. At a time when most practitioners believed disease spread through bad airs, Snow pondered an alternative. What if cholera had a material cause, one carried in what people ingested rather than breathed? He first articulated this idea in a little-read pamphlet on the mode of communication of cholera in 1849, arguing that contaminated water might serve as the unseen pathway of contagion. It was a lonely thesis, unreceived by the majority of his contemporaries, yet Snow was undeterred. As the outbreak of 1854 deepened in intensity, Snow seized an opportunity that would define his legacy. He walked the streets of Soho, house by house, noting where the ill lived and died. With meticulous attention, he plotted their addresses on a sheet of paper, early epidemiology in action, and overlaid the map with the locations of public water pumps. What emerged, startlingly clear, was a pattern. Most deaths clustered around a particular hand pump standing in the thoroughfare then known as Broad Street, now Broadwick Street. The association was too consistent to be accidental. The well from which that pump drew its water lay near polluted drains and cesspools, inviting contamination that no one at the time could visibly see but whose effects were lethal. Snow's logic was simple but revolutionary. If the water from the Broad Street pump was indeed the vehicle of this scourge, then removing access to it might slow or halt the spread of disease. On the 7th of September in that year, Snow appeared before the local Board of Guardians, a body responsible for poor relief and local affairs, and presented his evidence. His audience was understandably skeptical. The prevailing miasmatic doctrine still held sway among many physicians and civic leaders. But the pattern on Snow's map was compelling. After deliberation, the board agreed to an extraordinary act. The handle of the Broad Street pump was removed, rendering it unusable. In the weeks that followed, the number of new cholera cases in the immediate vicinity diminished sharply. For those who experienced it in real time, the receding tide of death appeared almost miraculous. Yet even here the story resists simple certainty. Later investigations suggested that the epidemic may have been naturally declining, or that residents fleeing the area had reduced the pool of susceptible hosts. Nevertheless, contemporary observers and later historians recognized this episode as a turning point, a moment when evidence, observation, and a willingness to challenge orthodoxy combined to show what was true even if the microscopic details remained beyond reach. While London's experience at Broad Street occupied the center of attentions, other European cities were not spared similar catastrophes. In the summer of 1853, Stockholm endured a harrowing epidemic. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost as cholera spread through the city's inadequate water and waste systems. This loss spurred local authorities to rethink sanitation. By the end of that decade, Stockholm had inaugurated centralized waste handling, and by 1861 had established its first proper waterworks, interventions that, in time, curbed the recurring outbreaks. Such episodes underscored a common truth in the age of nascent industrialization, that water quality and waste management were not merely conveniences, but determinants of life and death. Yet even as Snow's evidence gathered notice, the broader medical community remained divided. Many statisticians and physicians, entrenched in miasmatic explanations, accepted the clustering of cases on Snow's map, but resisted the conclusion that water was the vector. They insisted that bad air was still the primary culprit. In London, a subsequent outbreak in 1858 would be remembered less for its human toll and more for the overpowering stench rising from the River Thames, whose polluted waters, carrying sewage from thousands of homes, had become so foul that Parliament itself was driven to sanction a massive sewer project. This great stink would ultimately lead to the construction of a new sewer system designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette, an infrastructure enterprise that changed the face of the city. While Snow did not live to see universal acceptance of his ideas, he died in the year 1858. His work laid the conceptual groundwork for a new era in public health thinking. The cholera epidemics in London, in Stockholm, and in countless other towns and cities whose names have been lost to time, forced a painful but necessary reckoning. They revealed that dense urban life, if uncoupled from deliberate systems to manage water and waste, could become a crucible of suffering. They also showed that patterns of disease might yield to careful observation and thoughtful intervention, even when the invisible agents of contagion remained beyond the gaze of technology. The questions raised by these crises: what connects a death in a crowded alley to the flow of water in a well? How does the life of a city depend on the unseen movements of molecules and filth, which shape the next wave of sanitary reform? The story of cholera in the mid-19th century is not simply a catalog of deaths, but a profound pivot toward understanding that the health of a city is inseparable from the systems that supply its water and carry away its waste. In facing cholera, urban populations confronted more than an epidemic. They met a question of responsibility. Whose task was it to ensure that the water drawn at a pump was fit to drink, that the waste of a household would not return to poison the next? The answer, as this momentous year showed, lay not solely in individual practice but in collective action, in public infrastructure, in evidence-based policy, and in the courage to revise long-held beliefs in the face of mounting evidence. Such realizations, born of profound human suffering, would usher in the era of modern sanitation and urban hygiene reforms in the decades to come. A legacy that stretched far beyond the narrow streets of Soho and into the changing face of cities across the world. In the wake of successive cholera epidemics and the insistent alarms sounding from crowded quarters of sprawling industrial cities, a profound, and at first hesitant, transformation began to take shape. This transformation was neither sudden nor uniform, but rather a movement of minds and institutions that gradually bound sanitary concern with civic responsibility. It was in the year 1838, in the bustling urban landscape of industrializing Britain, that the first clear outlines of what historians would later call the sanitary movement began to coalesce. This was not simply an assemblage of engineering solutions to raucous slums. It was a new lens through which cities themselves were perceived, as environments whose health could be shaped by conscious policy and collective action, rather than left to the blind flux of economic pressures. The sanitary movement emerged in response to the mounting evidence that the disease burdens afflicting these ever-expanding towns were not random acts of fate, but consequences of their living conditions and the human labor that produced them. At the heart of this nascent movement stood a figure whose name would echo through the evolving institutions of public health: Edwin Chadwick. Born at the turn of the 19th century, Chadwick was trained in law and steeped in the utilitarian philosophy that sought the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He came to see the link between poverty, disease, and environment not merely as moral observation, but as a subject worthy of systematic inquiry. Appointed to the Poor Law Commission in 1832, he traveled through urban districts, observing firsthand the crowded courts of row housing, the miasmic atmospheres of open gutters, and the tangled proximity of privies and water sources. In July of 1842, he published a document that would become one of the most influential social reform texts of the century: the Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population of Great Britain. In this sweeping account, Chadwick documented the deplorable conditions of working-class neighborhoods and marshaled evidence, connecting poor sanitation with disease and premature death. Chadwick's report challenged assumptions and stirred debate because it framed sanitation not as a luxury for the well-to-do, but as a necessity for social stability. He argued that the sufferings of the poor, who bore the brunt of cholera, fever, and other maladies, were rooted in environmental conditions that could and should be rectified. He pressed for improved drainage, for the systematic removal of refuse from streets and homes, for the provision of clean drinking water, and for a medical officer in every town who would oversee these efforts. Chadwick's recommendations extended beyond moral exhortation. They were proposals for administrative structures and public works that would alter the very skeleton of urban life. Yet, even for his peers, his ideas were startling. Many city fathers were unaccustomed to thinking of health as a collective civic responsibility, and many property owners resisted changes that could cost money or disrupt existing economic arrangements. Private companies that managed water and sewage services jealously guarded their turf, seeing Chadwick's proposals as threats to profit and local autonomy. And physicians, many still entrenched in older medical theories, were skeptical of attributing disease patterns to sanitation rather than miasma, humors, or divine displeasure. In this tension, the sanitary movement found both its greatest challenges and its defining thrust. Chadwick's work did not remain an isolated publication. It fed a burgeoning public awareness and precipitated organizational responses. In 1844, the Health of Towns Association was formed, a coalition of reformers, physicians, writers, and lay citizens who campaigned for cleaner streets, better water supplies, and public accountability for environmental conditions. This association brought the calls for reform into broader civic dialogue, drawing attention from media, politicians, and parliamentary committees. By the late 1840s, the combined pressures of epidemic disease, public agitation, and mounting statistical evidence forced the British Parliament to act. In the waning days of August 1848, the Public Health Act was enacted, the first legislation in Britain to assert governmental responsibility for sanitary conditions. What did this act signify in human terms? Imagine a council chamber in a provincial town, its benches polished by years of routine debate, now hosting a heated discussion about the collection of refuse and the cleaning of streets. Think of the clerk reading aloud sections of the act that empowered local boards to survey water sources and enforce regulations about drains. These were incremental measures, often hampered by limited funds and patchy enforcement, yet they marked a seismic shift. Health was no longer solely the private affair of families drawn in by fate and fortune. It was now part of the ledger of civic governance, of taxes paid and responsibilities borne in common. Across the English Channel, echoes of these ideas could be felt in France and other parts of Europe, where medical professionals and urban planners likewise contended with the twin challenges of crowded streets and contagious disease. In many cases, cholera outbreaks had prompted local authorities to consider, and sometimes enact, measures tantamount to those first outlined by British reformers. Improved water supplies, campaigns to empty cesspools, and regulations that aimed imperfectly, but meaningfully, to reduce the visible signs of filth. The notion that detailed mapping, public inspection, and environmental management could confer health upon a population was a novel departure from earlier centuries, where disease was often understood as divine punishment, inevitable fate, or inscrutable miasma. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the sanitary movement was that it operated at multiple scales. In the bustling docks of Liverpool or Bristol, where goods from distant continents arrived alongside waves of new laborers from the countryside, municipal engineers and health officials now pondered matters that had once been the exclusive concern of householders. Where does the water come from? Where does the waste go? How can streets be drained not just of rain, but of the debris of daily life? In newly chartered towns in the United States, too, reformers drew inspiration from their British counterparts, founding local health boards and advocating for sewer systems, paving, and regulated slaughterhouses. These developments did not happen overnight, nor were they seamless. But they signaled a decisive turn. Sanitation was becoming a centerpiece of civic identity and political priority. Yet the movement was not without its contradictions and limits. The Public Health Act of 1848 was, by many measures, an imperfect instrument. Its sweeping language offered broad authority but lacked mechanisms for uniform enforcement, especially in poorer communities where resources were thin and political will was weak. Even so, it laid the legal and institutional foundations upon which later reforms would build. Subsequent legislation, such as the Sanitary Act of 1866 and the Public Health Act of 1875, continued this process of codifying responsibilities for drainage, nuisances, housing conditions, and disease reporting. The emergence of the sanitary movement was thus not merely a reaction to epidemics like cholera. It was a broader intellectual and political shift in which cities began to see themselves as environments that could be curated, cleansed, and governed for the collective welfare. Where once filth had been an inescapable byproduct of human congregation, it was now understood, if still imperfectly, as a problem that could be addressed by collective effort, engineering skill, and institutional authority. In these decades, the scaffoldings of modern public health were erected, not by a single decree, but by the cumulative labors of reformers, engineers, physicians, and ordinary citizens who came to see the quality of urban life as inseparable from questions of water, waste, and sanitation. This was the moment when cities began to take responsibility for the unseen flows that sustain life at scale. And as they did so, they also began to lay the conceptual and physical groundwork for the next epoch, one in which sanitation would be woven ever more tightly into the fabric of urban governance, scientific inquiry, and civic belonging. In that unfolding tapestry, the ideas first articulated by the likes of Chadwick and his colleagues would continue to resonate, even as the very science of disease transmission advanced and new challenges arose across the cities of the world. The mid-19th century did not merely register new laws and scientific debates. It began to reshape the very ground beneath the feet of those who walked in Europe's great cities. Where once narrow, winding streets had threaded through markets and residences, where waste had pooled unseen against walls and moved unnoticed into watercourses, new ambitions of urban rebuilding took hold. The call for sanitation, born out of crises like cholera and the mounting awareness that filth and disease were entwined, grew into sweeping efforts to remake cities not just in ideas, but in stone, earth, and iron. In this transformation, the physical landscape of the city, its streets, tunnels, waterworks, and subterranean channels, became both the stage and the instrument of a new public health ecology that boldly challenged centuries of organic, unplanned growth. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this ambition is the story of Paris under the reign of Napoleon III. In the year 1853, Paris was a city that had expanded rapidly in population, yet struggled with overcrowded streets, limited water supplies, and the same uncollected waste that befell many cities of the era. Urban planners and leaders recognized that addressing these issues demanded a comprehensive redesign, not merely isolated repairs. Napoleon appointed Georges Eugene Haussmann, known simply as Baron Haussmann, to reimagine the city's fabric. For nearly 2 decades, Haussmann and his collaborators tore through densely packed neighborhoods, carving out wide boulevards where once labyrinthine alleys had reigned, and beneath those new avenues, laying an astonishing network of water and sewer infrastructure. They expanded water supply massively by constructing new aqueducts and reservoirs that could bring fresh water from outside the city's limits into the heart of Paris. At the same time, they rebuilt the sewer system entirely, enlarging tunnels, rerouting waste away from crowded quarters, and integrating drainage into the new urban plan. This was not incremental patchwork, but a strategic, large-scale intervention, guided by an architectural vision that saw infrastructure as integral to the identity and health of the city itself. The sewers of Paris, once cramped conduits carrying only liquid waste, were transformed into expansive galleries large enough for workers to stand upright and traverse. These conduits were designed with foresight to handle rainwater, household wastewater, and industrial effluent all at once, channeled efficiently toward outflows beyond the city. Underneath the newly laid boulevards, these underground channels hummed with purpose, as if the city's buried veins had been cleared of clots and reconnecting the life of the metropolis. Engineers constructed collector tunnels of astonishing size, several meters high and wide, that bore waste outward and invited systematic cleaning and maintenance rather than ad hoc neglect. This subterranean world, once hidden and shunned, became an explicit part of Paris's civic anatomy and a symbol of a city committed to hygiene and health. Across the English Channel, London faced its own watershed moment. By the late 1850s, the capital's explosive growth, outdated cesspits, and unchecked waste discharge into the River Thames had turned the river into a fetid, toxic artery winding through the heart of the metropolis. This combination of environmental neglect and burgeoning population once culminated in an event remembered as the Great Stink of 1858. As summer's heat intensified, the odor rising from the Thames grew so overpowering that Parliament was forced to adjourn its sessions, the stench invading even the halls of governance. The crisis laid bare the inadequacy of London's existing waste channels and galvanized political will for a radical solution. Into this breach stepped Sir Joseph William Bazalgette, a civil engineer appointed as chief engineer to the Metropolitan Board of Works. Bazalgette had long been involved in considerations of urban sanitation, and learning from the persistent outbreaks of cholera and the overwhelming evidence that waste was intricately tied to water quality, he began to sketch plans for a new system that would capture the city's wastewater and divert it far from human habitation. What emerged from his designs was among the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century. Miles upon miles of intercepting sewers laid beneath the city streets, connected into colossal main drainage channels that carried waste downstream to be released with the tides, far from the water intakes and daily life of Londoners. These conduits were not narrow pipes but broad underground boulevards, engineered with precision gradients and brickwork shaped into egg-like cross-sections that facilitated flow, even as the city above continued its restless growth. The Thames embankment, constructed as part of this vast sewer network, physically reshaped London's riverfront. Where once marshy banks had slipped and shifted, new embankments rose, accommodating both interceptor sewers and new urban spaces above. The result was a dual achievement: the removal of waste from the lifeblood of the city and the creation of new civic landscapes that reconceived how people moved, worked, and lived along the river. This blending of sanitation and urban design not only improved the city's environmental conditions, but also signaled a shift in how modern metropolises approached public health infrastructure, as central to urban identity as markets, parks, and monuments. Between the transformation of Paris and the reclamation of London's riverside, a new pattern took shape in the mid to late 19th century. Cities began to rebuild themselves from below as much as from above, guided by a recognition that health and hygiene were infrastructural as well as moral goods. These projects demanded enormous human and financial investment, involving tens of thousands of workers who dug, laid brick, and tested gradients, municipal authorities who negotiated budgets, political resistance, and technical challenges, and engineers who balanced empirical observation with daring innovation. The result was not merely cleaner streets and waters, but an emergent conception of the city as an engineered milieu, a place whose health could be actively cultivated by design rather than passively endured. The impact of these undertakings went beyond immediate improvements in sanitation. They reshaped the everyday rhythms of urban life, enabling denser populations to breathe more easily, to drink water less suspect, and to carry on commerce with fewer interruptions from epidemic disease. In Paris, broad avenues and orderly waterworks became synonymous with civic pride. In London, the reduced frequency of cholera outbreaks after the completion of Bazalgette's system stood as proof of the practical value of engineering intervention. Moreover, the success of such projects encouraged other cities across Europe and North America to embrace similar undertakings, introducing combined sewer systems that handled both stormwater and sanitary waste in ways previously unimaginable. Yet the achievements of this era were not without challenge or contradiction. The redistributions of urban space that accompanied sanitation improvements sometimes displaced entire neighborhoods, and the labor that built these systems was often unseen by those who benefited from their functions. Moreover, the sheer scale of work required in established cities underscored that retrofitting sanitation into ancient street plans was an extraordinary undertaking, one that demanded both technical ingenuity and political consensus. Even so, the willingness of cities to undertake such transformations marked a fundamental shift. Filth would no longer be accepted as an inevitable byproduct of urban life, nor would waste be allowed to mingle ungoverned with water, air, and day-to-day existence. In these decades of rebuilding from below, the city ceased to be a passive stage for human endeavor and became a crafted organism, shaped by deliberate intervention, industrial capability, and collective determination. In the tunnels beneath Paris and London, one can read a story of how urban societies stepped beyond mere survival in the face of disease and embraced a proactive, engineered approach to life in community. And as this narrative unfolds into the succeeding years, it will also reveal how the interplay of technology, policy, and human imagination continued to redefine the possibilities of urban health and sanitation across the globe. An ongoing effort that remains central to how we build, maintain, and inhabit cities today. In the decades following the great sanitary engineers' triumphs, the colossal sewers under Paris, the intercepting drains beneath London's River Thames, another transformation began to take shape, less visible beneath the streets, but perhaps no less profound in its impact on everyday life. If earlier eras had framed sanitation as a matter of infrastructure and disease outbreaks, now the idea of hygiene itself, the practices of daily living, began to emerge as a cultural force. People started to ask not only how waste should be carried away or clean water delivered, but how everyday habits, household practices, and communal norms could make cities healthier places to live. What had once been the province of magistrates and engineers gradually became a shared social project, embedded in manners, education, and public discourse. Imagine a bustling Victorian street in the late 1800s. Gas lamps cast a warm glow on stone facades. Carriages and pedestrians jostle with market stalls and shop fronts. Within the homes lining these streets, life unfolds in rhythms shaped by hearth and family. Mothers fetch water from taps supplied from distant reservoirs. Cleaners sweep doorways and stoops, and children play in alleys once choked with refuse, but now at least better drained. Behind these daily scenes, evolving ideas about what it meant to live healthfully were transforming how inhabitants understood their own bodies and environments. This evolution was not simply scientific. It was cultural and moral, shaping how people thought about cleanliness, the human body, and the responsibilities of citizenship. The roots of these ideas reached far back. Ancient philosophies like those of Hippocrates had linked environment and health, and many religious traditions enshrined practices of cleanliness and temperance as moral imperatives. But in the 19th century, these ancient strands wove into a more public and secular discourse about hygiene that was tied explicitly to urban life and the responsibilities of the individual within the collective. Sanitary reformers, doctors, writers, and activists began producing pamphlets and giving public lectures on everything from the proper disposal of household waste to the importance of fresh air in densely populated neighborhoods. Their message was simple and compelling. Personal habits mattered not only to the individual, but also to the health of the entire city. Schools, too, became arenas for this cultural shift. In classrooms from London to Chicago, children were taught songs and lessons about washing hands and keeping their clothes clean. Teachers integrated ideas about fresh air, rest, and exercise into daily instruction. Town hall meetings featured demonstrations of proper methods for cooking, laundering, and living that were once seen as mere domestic concerns, but now took on civic implications. These educational efforts were not uniform or uncontested. Debates over propriety, class norms, and religious prescriptions often surfaced in heated exchanges about what constituted proper conduct. Yet the very existence of these debates signaled a widening awareness of hygiene as a shared cultural value. Public campaigns and visual culture also played a role in shaping hygienic norms. By the closing years of the 19th century and into the early 20th, exhibitions and fairs showcased ideas about cleanliness and health in dramatic visual forms. The International Hygiene Exhibition held in Dresden in the year 1911, for example, drew millions of visitors and presented vivid displays of human biology, sanitation technology, and health education materials designed to communicate complex concepts to broad audiences. Although this event occurred slightly after the core 19th century reform era, it illustrates how deeply hygiene had penetrated public consciousness, not merely as a policy concern, but as a cultural spectacle that mobilized education and collective identity around health. Across urban landscapes, the languages of cleanliness and hygiene began to shape public architecture and everyday behaviors. Street signs exhorted passers-by not to spit on pavements or discard refuse on sidewalks. Newspapers carried columns advising readers on how to keep living spaces free of damp and pests. Municipal boards funded campaigns to supply soap and encourage toilets in public venues. These efforts reflected a broader idea articulated by reformers of the era, that health was not simply the absence of disease, but a condition to be actively cultivated through personal and communal practices. At the same time, this cultural turn in hygiene was not without tension. Traditional beliefs about disease causation, miasmas, humoral imbalances, sin, did not vanish overnight. For many ordinary people, religious and local explanations for sickness remained central to how they understood their bodies and environments. What was new, however, was the increasing presence of a public discourse that spoke of cleanliness in instrumental terms, not only as moral virtue, but as preventive practice grounded in observation and, increasingly, scientific reasoning. This discourse was not merely imposed from above. It emerged in conversations among neighbors, in women's reading circles, and in the evolving vernacular of urban advertisements and posters. The rise of this hygienic culture began to intersect with burgeoning scientific knowledge about microorganisms toward the latter decades of the 19th century. Although germ theory had yet to permeate every household, the idea that invisible agents might cause disease began seeping into public awareness, further reinforcing the importance of everyday cleanliness practices, from boiling water to airing bedding and scrubbing cooking surfaces. These behaviors, once seen as matters of propriety or comfort, now carried the weight of civic significance. They were framed as collective acts of protection, not only for one's own family, but for the neighborhood, the city, and even future generations. In this evolving cultural landscape, one sees the emergence of what historians have called a sanitary consciousness among ordinary people, a shared sense that keeping the body and its surroundings clean was integral to the well-being of the community. This consciousness was nurtured through education, media, public policy, and everyday social interaction. It was not imposed from a single center of authority, but blossomed in the interstices of urban life, shaped by voices as diverse as school teachers, reform-minded physicians, journalists, and mothers guiding children through the rituals of washing and dressing. By the dawn of the 20th century, the cultural dimensions of hygiene were firmly woven into the fabric of city life. Urban residents carried portable water bottles and wash basins. Newspapers featured columns on fresh air and balanced diet, and civic celebration sometimes honored health achievements as much as industrial or military triumphs. The once silent rhythms of daily cleansing had become audible in slogans, advertisements, and classroom songs alike. They reflected a profound shift. Hygiene was no longer a private matter but a public culture, a shared expectation that members of a community would participate in practices that supported not only their own health, but the collective well-being of the places they lived. In the next stage of this story, that cultural foundation will intersect decisively with scientific advances that make causes and mechanisms of disease increasingly visible. And that will reshape both individual behavior and public policy in ways that chart a new course for urban health and medicine. For now, we observe a world in which pipes and pumps have been laid, but the real challenge lies in how societies understand and enact the rhythms of everyday life, how they transform knowledge into practice and norms into shared commitments. When the roar of industrial chimneys and the bustle of crowded marketplaces had already reshaped the physical face of cities, and when the poets of sanitation had begun to speak boldly of clean streets, fresh water, and engineered sewers, another kind of transformation was quietly unfolding in the laboratories and lecture halls of Europe. In the late decades of the 19th century, thinkers and experimenters turned their eyes toward what could not be seen by the naked eye, the unseen world of microbes. And in doing so, they would reshape not only medicine, but the very logic of how societies understood disease and health. This was an extraordinary paradigm shift, one whose implications would reverberate across ages. The germ theory of disease, which finally gave scientific substance to the idea that specific microscopic organisms could be the direct agents of specific illnesses. For much of the 19th century, even after cities had built sewers and clean streets, many doctors and lay observers still explained disease through the lens of miasma theory, the belief that rotten air and noxious vapors rising from filth spread illness among those who inhaled them. Under miasma theory, the smell of a swamp, a cesspit, or a crowded alley was not merely offensive. It was a sign of danger itself, an atmospheric threat that could corrupt lungs and blood alike. In this intellectual climate, the sanitary movement and science were not opposed, but they operated on different assumptions. Engineers removed waste to reduce foul airs, while physicians sought to relieve suffering in ways familiar from older traditions. Into this ferment of observation and speculation stepped Louis Pasteur, a French chemist whose work in the 1860s began to reveal a startling truth about the world of living things too small to be seen. Pasteur's experiments on fermentation, food spoilage, and putrefaction demonstrated that invisible organisms, what we now call bacteria, were responsible for processes previously attributed to spontaneous generation or decay. By showing that sterilized broth stayed free of life unless contaminated from the outside, he challenged centuries of belief and opened a doorway to thinking about disease causation in radically new terms. Pasteur's discoveries did more than challenge old ideas. They offered a scientific foundation for understanding disease as a material process. If microbes could cause fermentation, why could they not cause disease? This question began to animate the scientific community, driving further inquiry and experimentation. By the early 1880s, the German physician Robert Koch was pushing that inquiry toward concrete, practical results. Koch isolated the bacillus responsible for anthrax, a disease that ravaged livestock and terrified rural communities, and showed that its presence in blood correlated with infection. He went on to develop a set of criteria, later known as Koch's postulates, for determining when a particular microorganism was the cause of a specific disease, isolating the organism, growing it in pure culture, and then reproducing the disease in a healthy host. These rigorous methods moved the study of disease causation from speculation into disciplined science. The implications of this work were nothing short of revolutionary. At once, the invisible world of microbes became a terrain of human knowledge rather than superstition, and disease itself was revealed as a phenomenon that could be observed, measured, tested, and ultimately prevented through targeted action. The leap from theory to practice did not happen overnight. Even the strongest proponents of germ theory faced resistance from colleagues wedded to older frameworks. But by the closing years of the century, the scientific evidence was overwhelming. Diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax were no longer vague forces of nature, but enemies whose agents could be identified under a microscope. In laboratories across Europe, scientists bent over early microscopes, watching the tiny shapes of bacteria multiply and interact with their surroundings. They began to classify organisms by shape and behavior: rods, spirals, spheres, building the taxonomy of the microbial world that would become the basis for modern microbiology. These efforts were not mere curiosities. They laid the groundwork for practical advances that transformed public health. Once a bacterium was linked to a disease, it became possible to devise ways to neutralize or prevent its spread. Pasteur himself demonstrated that weakened or inactivated microbes could stimulate immunity, foreshadowing the development of vaccines that would one day save millions of lives. The refinement of the sanitary revolution by science was not limited to bacteriology. It changed how practitioners thought about hygiene, water quality, and infection control. For decades, sanitation efforts had been justified on the grounds that removing filth and providing clean water seemed to reduce disease. Now, with germ theory gaining acceptance, public health officials could appeal to a deeper explanation: that eliminating specific microbes from water supplies, food, and surfaces could break the chain of infection. This was not only a conceptual victory, it was a practical tool for every city that sought to protect its citizens from epidemic disease. The cultural impact of these scientific advances was profound. Think back to the crowded wards of hospitals where only a generation earlier surgeons operated without washing their hands or sterilizing instruments, trusting instead in prayer, luck, or the vaguer notion of balanced humors. With germ theory's ascendancy, antiseptic techniques became part of the medical repertoire. Instruments were sterilized, wounds treated with antiseptic solutions, and barriers were erected between surgical fields and contamination. These changes reverberated beyond hospitals into public life. Awareness of invisible contagion informed everyday practices, from boiling water to isolating the sick, from filtering municipal supplies to regulating food markets. Germs became a part of the popular imagination, unseen enemies whose avoidance was a mark of modern citizenship. Resistance and controversy attended this shift, as it does with many revolutions in thought. Some practitioners doubted that microbes alone could explain every disease. Others feared that the new focus on microscopic life would eclipse the still valuable insights of environmental and social determinants of health, such as housing quality and nutrition. The debates at international sanitary conferences in the late 1900s, for example, showed that even as scientists like Koch presented incontrovertible evidence linking Vibrio cholerae to outbreaks, political bodies often resisted theoretical entanglements, preferring to focus on practical measures like quarantine and sanitation infrastructure. Yet this tension between theory and practice underscored a deeper truth. Science and society were learning to work together in the cause of public health. The discovery of germs did not diminish the importance of clean water and waste removal. It enriched it by showing the mechanisms by which contamination bred disease. Cities that had forged sewer networks and filtered water supplies now understood not only what they were doing, but why it mattered in scientific terms. And as the 20th century dawned, these two strands, engineered sanitation and microbial science, would weave together more tightly still, shaping immunization programs, hospital hygiene standards, and new policies for controlling outbreaks of influenza, diphtheria, and plague. This was the age in which invisible worlds became visible, where microscopes revealed organisms once only suspected, and where the logic of disease moved from the realm of air and smell into the precise language of bacteriology and infection. Through this transition, The sanitary revolution matured into a scientifically grounded public health practice. A practice that did not simply chase foul airs or cleanse streets, but confronted the true agents of disease with knowledge, method, and ever-advancing tools. And as the germ theory took hold, it would illuminate new paths forward, challenging societies to reconsider not just how they built cities, but how they lived in them, shared their water, and protected their neighbors from the unseen perils of microbial life. In the next and final chapter of our narrative, we will explore how the legacies of these scientific and infrastructural transformations shaped the modern city, the expectations of public health, the institutions that emerged from these ideas, and the indelible connections between sanitation, science, and the lived experience of urban communities. Long after the great sewer galleries were completed beneath Paris and London, and long beyond the laboratory breakthroughs that first made sense of invisible microbes, the legacies of the sanitary revolution took on new and varied forms in the cities of the modern world. These legacies are not merely the concrete channels that carry waste or the crystalline taps that deliver drinking water. They are woven deep into how societies conceive of public health, civic responsibility, and the very relationship between people and the environments they inhabit. The story of sanitation did not end with the engineering feats of the 19th century. Rather, that era laid the foundations for an ever-expanding and evolving public health infrastructure, whose effects continue to shape urban life across continents. In the years that followed the first wave of sanitary reforms, cities around the world began to embed the idea of public responsibility for health into their governing institutions and daily practices. Where once illness was widely accepted as a private misfortune or divine judgment, by the early 20th century, it had become something that communities and governments alike understood as, at least in part, preventable through collective action. This shift was anchored both in science, the germ theory of disease that made contagion intelligible, and in social values that held shared environments and infrastructure as critical to human well-being. Epidemiologists, statisticians, and municipal reformers increasingly collected data on population health, water quality, and environmental conditions, using this information not just to explain disease, but to justify and refine policies that shaped living conditions. Consider for a moment the simple yet profound human experience of drawing water from a tap rather than a communal well. In many metropolises of the present day, this everyday act signals centuries of accumulated knowledge and struggle. The engineering of reservoirs that gather water from unpolluted sources, the networks that crisscross hills and valleys, the filtration and treatment systems that ensure safety before water reaches domestic basins. The idea that clean water should be a public right, that its provision is a task for civic authorities rather than individual households, would have been remarkable to earlier generations. Yet today, in much of the industrialized world, it is taken as an unassailable norm, a testament to the enduring impact of the sanitary revolution's earliest proponents. The legacy of sanitation also extends to how urban planning and environmental policy intersect with public health concerns. The broad avenues and regulated building standards that reformers once insisted upon were early steps in what would become a persistent linkage between the built environment and human health. Cities today regulate not only water and waste disposal, but also air quality, food safety, and housing conditions, all in recognition that the physical environment exerts profound influence on population well-being. Mid-20th century reforms, post-war reconstruction efforts, and even late 20th century movements towards sustainable urbanism were shaped by the belief that health cannot be disentangled from water, air, and waste. The institutions that emerged from this history, municipal public health departments, environmental regulatory agencies, and international bodies concerned with water and sanitation access, are part of that legacy as well. They institutionalized the idea that society, not only families or private interests, bears responsibility for health conditions that arise from shared environments and collective living. In the United States and elsewhere, public health systems expanded throughout the 20th century to encompass sanitation, laboratory diagnostic capacity, environmental regulation, epidemic surveillance, and health education. A broad portfolio reflecting how multifaceted modern public health has become. Yet these legacies are not uniform or universal. The sanitary revolution that unfolded from the mid-19th century onward diffused unevenly across the globe. In some industrialized nations, waterworks and sewerage infrastructure were widely adopted by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In others, particularly in parts of the developing world, such systems were delayed or remain incomplete. These disparities reflect not only technological and economic differences, but also political priorities and historical trajectories. Today, billions of people still lack access to safely managed sanitation and clean drinking water, a stark reminder that the benefits of sanitary reform have not been shared equally. These inequalities provoke deep questions about history and responsibility. What does it mean that the engineering principles and public health practices developed in Victorian London and Haussmann's Paris are still not universally realized? How do political, economic, and social conditions accelerate or impede access to basic sanitary infrastructure? And in what ways do the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, rapid urbanization in megacities, and the threat of emerging pathogens intersect with the legacies of the past? In posing these questions, we see that the sanitary revolution is not merely an accomplished chapter, but a continuing dialogue between history, infrastructure, and human aspiration. The cultural inheritance of sanitation is equally profound. Cleanliness, hygiene, and public-minded behavior are values that have taken root in many societies, shaped by generations of schooling, public campaigns, and everyday practice. The idea that personal hygiene contributes to communal well-being, once a novel insight, is now embedded in norms ranging from hand-washing in schools to broad public awareness campaigns during outbreaks. These cultural norms have practical impact, enabling societies to mount collective responses to health threats with an agility and coherence that might have seemed unimaginable to residents of early industrial cities. At the same time, the expansion of public health into everyday life invites reflection on the balance between individual liberty and collective duty. Policies that regulate sanitation, vaccination, or environmental standards invariably prompt debates about the role of government, personal responsibility, and the limits of public intervention. These dialogues, present in democratic societies from city councils to national legislatures, are themselves part of the legacy of sanitary reform. They represent an ongoing negotiation over how best to protect the health of populations while respecting diverse cultural and political values. In the modern city, the shadow of the 19th century sanitary revolution is found in pipes and pumps, yes, but also in the expectations of citizens, the work of public agencies, and the ideas that animate collective life. The daily rhythms of flushing toilets, drinking safe water, and disposing of waste invisibly carry forward lessons learned through centuries of struggle, innovation, and tragic loss. They make possible the dense, vibrant urban communities that define contemporary life, while reminding us of the fragility of the systems that sustain us. As we walk the boulevards and cross the bridges of today's global cities, it is worth recalling that each drop of potable water and each hidden conduit transporting waste is part of a far older story. A story of human effort to tame contagion, to transform understanding, and to build environments that dignify rather than degrade life. These are not merely technical achievements, but testaments to humanity's enduring commitment to health as a public good, shaped by generations of inquiry, engineering, and unrelenting curiosity about how we live together.